Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Monday, September 23rd, 2024. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
Media commentary columnist and author of the new book, The Extinction of Experience, Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And Christine's colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, our Washington commentary columnist, Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
So if you are reading the press, you would get the idea that Israel has started a war with Hezbollah and Lebanon, whereas, of course, the fact is that Hezbollah started a war with Israel on October 8th of last year, that Israel has largely declined to respond to in large bore because it obviously had other business in the South. And beginning 3 weeks ago, and then, of course, with the staggering targeted assault on Hezbollah members using their electronic devices last week, has now finally entered the battle. The clear message of Israel seems to be to the government of Lebanon, in which Hezbollah plays a part. FAFO, like, okay, you want a war? You stop Hezbollah, or we are going to war in Lebanon. We have no choice. We're going to be in Beirut. We're going to be all over the place. We have sent out an announcement, the IDF did early this morning, the Israel Defense Forces, to the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, saying, everybody get out, just like they said in Gaza, everybody get out. You are not secure. This is where the Hezbollah rocketry is, and we are going in, and so make yourself scarce. And this is seen as an dangerous Israeli escalation in a war in which I believe the missile count or the rocket count fired from Lebanon, from Hezbollah to Israel in the last almost year, 11 and a half months, is somewhere around 10,000 warheads.
And we now have a new health ministry that will begin appearing in our newspapers and global media, because after the strikes today, the Lebanon Health Ministry reported the casualties without making any distinction between Hezbollah terrorists and civilians. And so in addition to the Gaza Ministry of Health, which has been rehabilitated over the past year from a trusted source to being recognized and acknowledged as Hamas propaganda outlet, to now another trusted source, we now have the Lebanon Health Ministry to cast a wary eye on the casualty figures that will come out of this military operation.
Okay, can I pull back and just say something that is glib and vapid, but sort of hit my ear as you were talking about some news in the United States over the last week about health ministries. Can we talk about American health ministries just for a second? This comes out of left field, I understand.
I don't think the Gaza Health Ministry is doing what the New York Health Ministry was going.
No.
You might be surprised.
But so we have two health ministry things. National Institutes of Health chief Francis Collins publishing a book, giving interviews everywhere, refusing to acknowledge the mistakes that were being made under his aegis during the COVID pandemic, and indeed talking snarkily about people who were skeptical of the measures that were ordered under his command. And then we have the news that New York City's health commissioner was having what appear to be sex parties. It's a little hard to tell whether they're drug parties.
They were both. He was rolling on Molly at sex parties. That's what.
Okay, is there such a thing as a drug party that's not a sex party? I'm really not sure. During COVID, in a bizarre, extreme version of what actually got Boris Johnson ousted as Prime Minister of England, where they would have a farewell party for somebody at 10 Downing Street, mixing drinks at 5 o'clock, and that was the end of Boris Johnson's political career. So health ministries, not a good period here, the 2020s, for the health ministries, either in the democracies or in these failed states or totalitarian states or terrorist states. Not that I want to parallel them, but it just did hit my ear. So
that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, it's a great decade for health ministries, because the health ministries are having a lot of fun, and the health ministries are getting quoted by the New York Times, and the health ministries are writing books and having these parties. So another way to look at it is that actually it's a wonderful time to be a health ministry.
I think you're right. I think, you know what, not only is that a more positive spin that can make them feel good about what they've done, but I think it is actually true that the only people who have been having fun either during COVID or during the war in Gaza are the health ministries.
This does raise an important question of authority. Who has the authority to speak and judge on certain matters, whether it's what to do during a pandemic that we haven't seen in a century, or who is the casualty of an Israeli military operation, or whether Israel, if indeed Israel was behind what happened and to Hezbollah operatives last week, was just war or not. And here I'm referring to, one wag calls it Operation Grim Beeper, which I kind of like. And Michael Walzer, the philosopher, descended from his eyrie in Princeton, New Jersey, to say that the pager plot violated the laws of war. And I was just agog reading this. I mean, Walzer has been, I'd say, pretty good in defending Israel's over the past year. But for someone of such eminence to not get the distinction, to grasp the difference between a completely legitimate strike against a terrorist army and actual, laws of war, was pretty baffling to me, though I guess not really surprising.
Well, how dare you? How dare you question? How dare you question
I know.
the author of a book called Just and Unjust Wars? He wrote a book called Just and Unjust Wars. And
That's all it takes, apparently.
You have the right. You have the right to question the absolute authority of his judgment.
I'm going to write a book called Right and Wrong by Matthew Continetti, then I will get the appointment at the Institute for Advanced Study, and the New York Times and Atlantic will come to me and say, Mr. Continetti, what is right and what is wrong? And I will opine.
It's a genius thing. Look what John Rawls did. All John Rawls did was write a book called A Theory of Justice, which is unreadable. And for 50 years, the idea was, well, John Rawls is our foremost moral philosopher of justice because he wrote the theory of justice.
Clearly, I'm wasting my time on this podcast. I need to get to work on my track, which will set me up for the rest of my life.
Yes, I would like to read from Michael Walzer, again, the author of the Just and Unjust Wars. And yes, for some reason, Michael Walzer gets a lot of credit from people in our camp because as he is a socialist, former editor of Dissent magazine, and a Princeton philosopher, the fact that he didn't immediately go and live in an encampment and said some things in the pages of Dissent suggesting that Israel attacked on October 7th without any, casus belli, was actually in the right to respond, was some heroic act of moral clarity on the part of this leftist figure. Let us just share a few words from Michael Walzer, the author of Just and Unjust Wars, to see where he comes down on this. Yes, the devices most probably were being used by Hezbollah operatives for military purposes. This might make them a legitimate target in the continuous cross-border battles between Israel and Hezbollah. Oh, the continuous cross-border battles between Israel and Hezbollah. You mean where Hezbollah is firing at Israel without any prior reason in a war that Israel does not seek and is attempting not to fight? Oh, I see. So it's a just war issue because they're at war together, whereas in fact Hezbollah is making war against Israel and Israel is not responding to Hezbollah. Okay, but the attacks came when the operatives were not operating. They had not been mobilized and they were not militarily engaged. Rather, they were at home with their families, sitting in cafes, shopping in food markets, among civilians who were randomly killed and injured. The theory of just war depends heavily on the distinction between combatants and civilians. Blah, 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 blah. Terrorists are always on the battlefield. That's the whole point of asymmetrical terrorist warfare. A terrorist doesn't wear a uniform. A terrorist is not engaged militarily in combat. That is what terrorism is: a turn, a twist, a gambit around. A Hezbollah terrorist is never off duty. A Hezbollah terrorist can be activated at a single moment. He does not wear a uniform. He is not in a military formation. He's not under a tent where somebody is playing Yankee Doodle on a banjo. There is no supply chain. Terrorists live in civilian populations. That's where they fight out of. And the idea that they are ever demobilized is itself a stain on just war theory, which is based on the idea that you can tell the difference between soldiers and civilians. The whole point of Hezbollah is to make it impossible to tell the difference.
It's like this immaculate conception theory of conflict. So as soon as Israel defends itself, the intellectuals look up and go, we're in this war that Israel is fighting. It just appeared. The war just appeared. There's no reference to who begins the war, whether it's Hamas attacking Israel on October 7th, when there had been a ceasefire the day before, or whether it's Hezbollah launching rockets into Israel beginning on October 8th. A rocket that, 6 weeks ago, one rocket hit a playground, a Druze playground in the north of Israel and killed children. And here we have the most precise, amazing espionage, sabotage operation in the history of armed conflict, where it all goes to the pagers that Hezbollah hands out to the Hezbollah operatives, and somehow this is Israel's fault.
Look, the Trojan horse, obviously, clearly a violation of the rules of just war and
where did the Trojan War begin? It began when the horse showed up. We don't even know what happened with Penelope.
Right. Yeah, and the killing of Bin Laden too.
Helen, sorry.
Yeah,
and the killing of Bin Laden. He was just hanging out in the bottom watching videos.
He wasn't a combatant.
Yeah,
Saddam wasn't a combatant.
It was after 5.
Right. I mean, the thing is,
that's what his GChat status said. After 5.
Even if you if we pretend to believe in this idea that you shouldn't hit terrorists during off hours, this was hardly downtime for Hezbollah. They've been extraordinarily busy being Hezbollah for a year now.
Hezbollah.
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing is lunacy.
Yeah, well, this is part of what makes these things what makes the terrorist group so effective at getting advocates in the West, because they are cowards. They're never, I mean, Hamas on October 7th was the exception to the rule, right? But they're never just like gathering information and then riding into battle. That's not what they do. That's why asymmetric warfare is not symmetric warfare. That's why all these things have different terms for them for what we're doing, because they are not, in armed formation, but they've been shooting rockets, as you said, forever. And so what do you consider a soldier at war? And is Israel, does Israel have to check like the resume of every guy like they have in Hamas? Like this guy from Al Jazeera turns out to be, commander in the tank thing. Like that's what makes them so effective, is that if you fall into their trap, you can never hit them. That's the trap. Once you accept the Hezbollah way of war, everything changes and they're invincible.
But there's an intellectual trap in the West as well. And that's I think why it's interesting to see how Walzer has just fallen into it, because earlier, post October 7th, he'd written a couple of pieces that very carefully tried to talk about, look, there's a distinction between, opposing Israel, and he had this whole idea of people-centered politics because he protested Vietnam when he was a kid, and he actually did try to parse these various things, right? I mean, if you all could see John's face right now, you would not. My attempt to play the devil's advocate is not persuading.
I've spent 45 years being nauseated by Michael Walzer. I just want to say that.
But to give him his due,
paragon of. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
But this is the trap: is that it's unsustainable because people-centered politics. If you're putting the people first, Hezbollah and Hamas both use people as human shields. They do not want to acknowledge that. They do not want to acknowledge the role civilians play in also being paid by terrorist groups to hold hostages and whatnot. That's too messy and complicated for them. It's much easier to just say, this is a violation of just war. But there's another issue here too, which is that, look, Biden's going to the UN this week. Biden's starting to really get worried about his, record as a president, his foreign policy record in particular. The Middle East is a much less safe place than it was when he took office. So are other regions in the world. And so I think we're going to start to see a real rehabilitation effort, a real rewrite the narrative effort on behalf of this administration in the next few months.
Just one more point about this. The idiots saying that this operation, the pager plot, Operation Grim Beeper, it was terrorism. I mean, how imbecilic can you get? Yeah. I mean, they include a former CIA director calling it a form of terrorism.
Not just a CIA director. He was the White House chief of staff. He was a congressman. He runs he's been, again, if you want to talk about like people who are otherwise respectable, we're talking about Leon Panetta. Leon Panetta is somebody who has been a reasonably stalwart person on the use of the projection of American power when necessary in the course of his career as a defense and intelligence
and was
person,
trotted out at the Democratic convention to endorse Kamala Harris's national security credentials.
Right.
And now he can't tell the difference between terrorism and a legitimate intelligence
establishment
operation.
Changing. He's an establishment guy. If anybody in the universe is an establishment figure, and that's a sign of the establishment itself changing. The blurring of the lines between, the outsiders and the establishment.
Right. Okay. Here's why I'm particularly exercised. So just war theory, I go into a history of just war theory, but just war theory is an effort to codify something that is by definition extraordinarily difficult to codify. And it has been an obsession, particularly with Catholic teaching for, 1,500 years. I mean, it's a very central idea that there is some way that you can determine whether or not martial conflict does or does not suit some version of God's law. Fine. So most understanding of war is somebody attacks somebody else, and then the other person fights back, and then at the end, somebody wins and somebody loses. Just war stuff starts coming in when either one or the other starts trying to figure out a way to win that then pulls in, creates outrages or something like that to break the will or the spirit of the opponent. And this is done on both sides, and we can go through the Civil War, the burning of Atlanta, the behavior of the Union Army as it went at Sherman's march through the South, all that. And then, of course, the Confederate Army's bad behavior in having launched and basically having created the conditions for the war. And it is a conversation that comes very close to not to mention Catholic theology again, or medieval Catholic theology, how many angels dance on the head of a pin. War is somebody attacks somebody else, the other person fights back, and somebody wins and somebody loses. In this case, when you think about what happened, Hezbollah launched a war on Israel. The war on Israel has been going on for almost a year. Israel has largely avoided engaging. And what it did in the pager incident, assuming that it was Israel, as I guess we still continue to have to say, is that it allowed its enemy to pick the targets that it was going to hit. Israel had no role whatsoever All it did was send them the machines. It didn't pick who got the pager. It didn't strike the pager, the person. It struck the machine handed out by the organization. I can't think of anything that less fits an attack on a just war theory than the idea that there is something illegitimate about that. Israel didn't shoot anybody. It blew up inanimate devices in the hands of people to whom it did not give the pagers.
Well, this is also the Twitterization of politics, because if you remember years ago, and by Twitterization I just mean the general public gets outraged about stuff, and then that thing is declared, forbidden. Like, if you remember years ago now, but Jon Stewart was debating Harry Truman and the dropping of the atomic bomb, and his guest, I don't even remember who it was, his guest asked him, well, then it was Harry Truman a war criminal? And Jon Stewart said, yes. You know what? Yes. And there was such an outcry that the next day he opened his show by saying, yesterday I said something about good old Harry Truman, and I in the heat of the moment, and he took it back. But the point is that these are, when they're subject to these sort of, these public debates, when they get Twitterized, when they get taken in by the obsessive political activist sector and the loudest in the room, you just get the rules, the laws.
Well, it's easy to cast
by.
It's easy to cast moral judgment when you have no skin in the game. And intellectuals
not just,
never have any skin in the game.
But that's the point. I don't know that this is the Twitterization. We're mentioning two figures here as being particularly guilty of intellectual and philosophical error. And one of them is a former congressman, White House chief of staff, Secretary of Defense, and CIA director. And the other is America's foremost legal philosopher of law and justice and nobility, as he sits there in Princeton, having spent many years editing a garbage socialist quarterly. So that's not Twitter. As far as I can tell, a lot of people on Twitter thought that what happened last week was awesome and amazing. And it is this high.
But AOC was one of the first really to make it a big.
Okay, but AOC is also again an elite figure. She's a member of Congress. Leon Panetta has the Leon Panetta Institute for Leon Panettaism in the Leon Panetta Village somewhere.
Okay, Matt, that's your second project after the book, the Continentarianism.
I really need to get to work. I feel so lowly here.
So I think we're back at a sort of Reagan division here, which is, I don't think the ordinary Joe thinks that Israel did bad here. I think that you have to have an advanced degree in having your children and grandchildren yell at you about how Israel is committing war crimes, and you want to make good with them so that Thanksgiving dinner isn't ugly. And yes, I'm talking about you, Michael Walzer, and other people I know, including some East Side rabbis that I won't mention. That's why
you're saying it's an idea so dumb only an intellectual would believe it.
Right. That's the great Orwell line. Anyway, I'm sorry to get like excessively agitated here, but I mean, there is no argument. This is literally not a legitimate argument, which is why I think Abe said that this is lunacy. But that's the problem, is it's not lunacy. You can't say it's lunacy if Michael Walzer is vocalizing it. It's worse than lunacy. It's sophistry.
It's also the Biden administration doubling down and saying, John Kirby went on ABC News and said there are better ways, cautioning Israel not to launch war against Hezbollah and saying we can have a diplomatic solution. So there's a policy impact here too, which is they're going to run the same playbook they did with negotiating.
Meanwhile, and before I take a quick break, is everybody sitting down? I'm giving the everybody sitting down speech because I know, this happens and I have to deliver bad news every couple of days that, is going to shock you and surprise you and really dishearten you. But yesterday or the day before yesterday, John Kirby acknowledged that Hamas was not really playing ball in the negotiations. And today, formally, Hamas has rejected the latest ceasefire negotiation, demanding a return to the July ceasefire proposals, which it had rejected. I don't even know what they were. We don't know what they were, but I know. I just want you to sit down.
From the May proposal,
yeah,
which
I just want you all to be, yes. I just want you all to.
They can't even, but they can't contact Sinwar. So my question is the old Henry Kissinger line: Who are they calling if they want to call Hamas?
Right. By the way, that's another part of the story we should mention is people don't think that this has actually happened, but no one knows where Sinwar is, and the Israelis were starting yesterday to try to investigate to see whether or not Sinwar somewhere in the Gaza tunnels had been wounded or hit in a strike or some kind of an attack. And my sources, such as they are, seem to think that it is. They do not think that it is likely that he was gotten, but the command, control, and communications of Hamas have now completely collapsed, as he can no longer communicate with anybody, and so therefore, since he's the battlefield commander, there are no the three C's have now Israel has now irreparably damaged them. It would appear. And so the diplomacy. Let's say a Misha Barach for the diplomacy. It's play taps for the wonderful diplomatic solutions. And Abe, let me just ask you a question, because you have been wondering this yourself. What's Kamala Harris going to say now that the White House has definitively said that there is no ceasefire deal?
Well, the White House has said there's definitively no ceasefire deal now. I continue to think the White House will re-up a new ceasefire proposal, gin up some talk about some. We're feeling strong about it this time, and I think that will keep alive this ridiculous line that Kamala Harris keeps proffering.
Let's do a play. Let's play act for a second. Okay, so I'm an interviewer, and I say to you terrible things in Israel and Gaza. Things are, Israel, Gaza. It's so sad. It's terrible. Israel. October 7th is coming. What is your policy, Vice President Harris?
I will continue to push as I have been pushing, as has the Biden-Harris administration, that the only solution here is to bring the parties together, okay? To have a talk and really get people in the room to bring together the parties for a deal to return the hostages. And we have been trying that since day one. Thank you.
You left out good. Palestinian state.
Man.
It was fantastic.
You left out Palestinian state, but otherwise...
That's the only thing that's missing.
Slightly less nasal, but still good.
You might want to consider a recurring segment having Kamala.
Yeah, that was James Austin Johnson level. That was very, very impressive. And you know what else is impressive, you guys? I want to talk to you about the Competitive Enterprise Institute's How the World Works podcast, featuring political commentator, commentary contributor, wise man, pro-stylist extraordinaire, and talker extraordinaire Kevin Williamson. Each episode, Kevin sits down with a notable guest to discuss the jobs they've had, why work matters, and the role of work in our social lives. After all, work involves a lot more than paychecks cashed. So listen to How the World Works wherever you listen to podcasts, or visit cei.org/podcasts. Polling, a lot of polling out. Polling at the end of last week, polling this morning, polling from the New York Times, Siena, polling from Emerson. And guess what? It's tied race. I don't know if you're sitting down. It's tied race. Nationally, polls are showing Harris 2, 3, 4 points up, 7 battleground states. The Emerson poll in particular, which came out this morning from the Hill, 1 point in every state, I believe. All 7 battleground states, Harris and Trump separated by 1 point. In some cases, Trump is up by 1 point. In some cases, Harris is up by 1 point. Remember, in these polls, 1 point means 17 people or something like that. I mean, it's that. It doesn't mean, it's not statistically significant.
Look, the most important
yes.
poll in the country is the New York Times Siena poll, because
Yes.
the New York Times is the paper that everyone reads, and it sets the agenda for every day. And this morning, the New York Times Siena poll showed that Donald Trump is ahead in the 3 Sunbelt states of North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona. And if he wins those 3 states, he only needs to pick off Pennsylvania, where the race is extremely close, to win the election. And so the story in the New York Times this morning kind of nullifies the excitement that many Democrats felt just 24 hours earlier on Sunday, when a combination of polls from NBC and CBS showed Harris with momentum, and even though a very close race. Now, one interesting aspect of the NBC poll, before I talk about the New York Times, is the NBC poll, which showed Harris up, I think, about 4 nationally.
5, I think 5.
5 nationally, yeah, and doing well, was taken prior to the second Trump assassination attempt. So it's a little bit weird that they held the poll for that long before releasing it. This poll from the New York Times captures everything that's happened since the second Trump assassination attempt. But what I love most about it is every time that the New York Times Siena poll shows a close race where Donald Trump may actually be in something of a catbird seat for the election, Nate Cohn, the New York Times chief election analyst, who's a very nice guy and a very smart guy, and I think a pretty even-handed guy, feels compelled to apologize to his readers for the results of his own poll. So when last week's poll came out and it showed that essentially the race was tied nationally, but Harris had a lead in Pennsylvania, Cohn went out of his way to say, well, look, it's a little bit odd that we're showing these 2 different results. We don't know why, but the Pennsylvania results are good for Harris, and it could be the national polls wrong, or, And then this morning, the same thing, he had with this poll showing Trump ahead in these 3 critical south and southwestern battlegrounds. Cohn has to say, look, it could be many things. I don't really know what's going on. It's just a performance that I find very amusing. I'm sorry he has to do it, but I'm sure it must be very frustrating as well if your job is to study polls, conduct polls, and you get back these polling results that we've had for months now showing basically it is a tied race everywhere. And as our friend Harry Anton points out unceasingly, this is not only the closest election this century, the 21st century, but it's the closest election since the 1960 election between Kennedy and Nixon.
I want to put meat on the bones of what you just said, using a specific person in the world of election reporting and study to show the kind of pressure that somebody like Nate Cohn is under. I'm referring to Michael McDonald. Michael McDonald is a professor at the University of Florida and an extraordinarily useful political scientist, because what he does every election year, particularly presidential years, is that after election day, he keeps a daily tally of the election results. And remember, in presidential elections, it takes 2 months. States report out new numbers every day as they count new ballots, or as provisional ballots get counted in certain places and all that. And remember that the vote total that we get, say, the Wednesday morning, assuming this Wednesday morning after election day that there will even be a declared winner, which we all have to prepare ourselves for the, I guess, 50-50 chance that there will not be a declared winner Wednesday morning, that the vote goes on and that 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 million more votes are counted from then until basically January. So he is a very useful person, a good follow on Twitter, a person to pay attention to, but he's also a partisan lunatic. And I say this advisedly because so last week the battleground polls reported by the New York Times were good for Harris. They showed her up in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan. I can't remember where else. So today, the Sun Belt state polls are good for Trump, right? Trump's up 3 in North Carolina, 4 in Georgia, 5 in Arizona. Same poll, same polling company, good for the Northeast, for Harris, bad in the Sun Belt for Harris, right? And here is what he says. I've said this many times. I don't know if this is right or wrong. We won't know until we get the election results. There is just something fundamentally different about the NYT poll that makes it predictably pro-Trump compared to the other polls. Now, remember, I'm talking about somebody who, as I say, does something valuable that Nate Cohn, I'm sure, relies on himself as a piece of, hard data during the post-election period. And what is this but playing the refs? He's just putting pressure on Nate Cohn to do whatever he can to report out polls in the way that Michael McDonald would like them to come out, either because he can't bear to look at a poll that suggests that his desideratum in November might go in the most horrifying way possible for him, or he's just like shaking his finger at Cohn to see if he can get him to cross-tab something in some way that will lead to a better result. And isn't the whole point about polling that you want an accurate picture of something? Now, I know there's a whole world where there's push polling and, right-wingers like certain polls because they do special sauce that makes it look better. And left-wingers used to like public policy polling out of North Carolina because mysteriously it was always good for Democrats. And Zogby's poll collapsed because it was too pro-Democrat, all that. But I mean, this is right here in front of us. The New York Times poll was good for Harris last week and bad for Harris today. And that proves that the New York Times has a pro-Trump bias. That is what people like Nate Cohn and Harry and by the way, and this obsessed assault on Nate Silver, who is now just on his own Substack. He doesn't, he's not part of some large organization, the Times or ABC News, saying he's got this model and the model shows X, Y, or Z. The model is now basically shifted to a pretty much a 50-50 call. But for a while, it was showing Trump with a 60% chance of winning. Then, like last week at some point, it went to Harris with a 51% chance of winning. Now it seems to have reverted to Trump with a 52% chance of winning. And if you don't know what kind of abuse Nate Silver is subjected to on Twitter for having built this model that he doesn't even control. In other words, he controlled it 4 months ago when he built the model. Then it just has inputs, and then the model spits something out. And he himself, a little like the scientist on Star Trek who had the M5 computer that starts running the ship, and he refers to it as though it's not part of himself. The model says it. What can I do? But it is kind of true. He's not adjusting the inputs. He made it. He's sticking with it. And it is as though he is committing a war crime by having his model adjust every day based on new polling data.
Well, ideologues treat pollsters like emotional terrorists when the polls don't go their way. And it's completely baffling, but it's the emotional investment in the outcome. And so he's punished for it, even though he's quite transparent about the weaknesses of his model, if you read his Substack.
I think both campaigns understand how close this election is. And just playing around with 270 to win, if you assume that the NYT polls of both the Sun Belt states and the Rust Belt states are correct, you have weird situations where Nevada is the critical state, where the
Nebraska too.
I was just about to say the electoral vote up in Nebraska, it could be the difference between a tied election that the House would vote for Trump for president. We'll talk about chaos, but that you see a new effort by the Trump campaign to change the law in Nebraska so that the winner of Nebraska gets all the states.
Should we explain this? Nebraska and Maine count their electoral votes by congressional district. Each state has 2 congressional districts, I believe, right? Maine has 2. Anyway, Nebraska certainly has 2. And so
no, they have
one
3
of them.
each.
Oh, they have 3 each. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But one of them in each state, I think it can tilt blue, like has blue in it.
Right.
And so in Nebraska in particular, if this one district, Nebraska 2, were to go blue in a state in which, as you say, X, Y, and Z happens, we could be at 269, 269, and that one vote makes it 270, 268, and Biden wins, Harris wins.
One of the Nates, I think it was Nate Silver, had a piece last week talking about how Alaska could be critical. But there was a poll out of Alaska last week of the House race, which showed that Republicans are doing pretty well. In the race this close, no one knows what's going to happen. And so much will matter or depend on small things, which I think is a reason we should pay close attention to what's happening with the Trump ground game. Turnout operations, you always hear a lot about them in election years. Of course, in 2012, there was the infamous Operation Orca that the Romney campaign invested a lot of money into figuring out turnout there, and Orca broke down on the day of the election, so that wasn't a good sign for Mitt Romney's campaign. This year, the Trump campaign, rather than spend $1 billion on micro-targeting and voter contact like it did in 2020, has basically said that they're going to outsource turnout and spend a lot of money through the RNC on election integrity, making sure that people don't commit voter fraud. And this could actually end up mattering. Now, I know that earlier this year, before Iowa, I said a similar argument, and I wondered whether the fact that DeSantis's turnout operation, which he had spent a lot of money in, might make a difference in an election in Iowa. And of course, I was completely wrong, and the Trump voters all came out. So maybe that won't matter. But little things, again, something as small as whether there's another debate, right? Kamala Harris says she wants to attend and participate in another CNN debate. Donald Trump said over the weekend that it's too late for another debate. Conversely, Kamala Harris has bowed out of the Al Smith dinner, this kind of tradition in American politics where the 2 nominees go and talk to, basically it's a Catholic organization in New York City. And Harris said she's not going to do it, which is a little bit odd. So these small decisions could actually have outsized impact in this very unusual election.
We should talk then maybe for a couple of minutes about this screaming outrage on the part of the, I talked about this on Friday, but on the part of sort of organized Jewry and liberal Jewry to get to have their hair stand on end at Trump saying last week that he's the best friend of Israel, and it's crazy that any Jew would not vote for him, all of which is stuff that he's said before, and then said if he loses, Jews will have a lot to do with the fact that he lost. And that statement, that sentence, has caused institutional outrage of a sort that is not quite caused by other things for such people like Rick Jacobs of the Reform Movement, or Elliot Cosgrove of Park Avenue Synagogue, or many other people who seem to find Trump uniquely evil and as a voice of terrifying Nazi anti-Semitism by saying your vote means a lot to me and I'm going to be very upset if I don't get it. And, I think it's ridiculous. Jews make up, again, 2% of the population, and that's not a big deal nationally. And Jews make up a lot of money that goes into the political coffers. And I believe probably the lion's share of it is going to the Harris campaign in the form of money from people like George Soros and his son and Peter Lewis, or the family of Progressive Insurance and others. Though there are, of course, many Jewish donors on the right, including Miriam Adelson and that sort of thing. But yeah, Trump talks the way Trump talks, and he talks like a thug, and he was talking a little thuggishly there. But I just view this, and I can't help it. Seth has written about this, and I want him to ventilate on it a little bit. But the simple fact of the matter is that organized Jewry is worried because Trump is showing in poll after poll better numbers for a Republican for president than anyone has shown since Ronald Reagan in 1980. And this will be, they don't want this. They don't want this to happen. And they are horrified by the idea that somebody who signed the Abraham Accords and moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and is saying Israel needs to win the war in Gaza, which is something that Kamala Harris has not said, that maybe Jews for whom Israel is a primary concern would think that's my guy, as opposed to Kamala Harris putting out TikToks about how monstrous the conditions are in Gaza without mentioning Hamas's role, primary, central, and in fact moral role in the fact that things are monstrous in Gaza. But Seth, you wrote about Trump talking this way months ago, and critically, and I think it's fair to say he deserves criticism. This is not the way you should talk about a minority ethnic group. But go ahead.
Yeah, Trump gets into trouble really when he starts talking about Jews as if they're Israelis, which is, as if they're immigrants. He has this. That's when he gets into trouble. The other stuff is really just Trump bluster. It's going to be a close election. You guys got to get out there because the other side is really bad for you and you have the power to swing it, is what he's saying in his own Trumpified way. But I would say that, my memory keeps going back to what happened when he was president, when he made some really obnoxious remarks. I think actually it was something about real estate. He was in Florida and he looked out into the room and he said, you guys know a good real estate deal, or something like that, to a Jewish gathering. And then he said he didn't realize the backlash, whatever. All right, what can we do? And his administration brought him the executive order that would apply Title VI civil rights protections to Jews on campus in a way they hadn't been recognizably done before. Now, that idea percolated up from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, which had its, base essentially had approved it, but didn't sign the executive, didn't actually put it forward. But the Obama administration was pretty
amazing. It was too busy trying to find ways.
Sitting down. This is a sitting down. Sitting down.
Yeah, it was too busy trying to find ways to prosecute people falsely charged of sex crimes on campus. Right. That was really the purpose of the Department of Education under Obama.
Right. Title VI will come later. It's all about Title IX. Title VI come later. But so he picked this up. So his aides came to him and they said, "Look, we have this ready to go. This is one of those things that you deploy when the time is right. Maybe this would be a good time to do it because everybody's yelling at you about anti-Semitism." Trump signs the executive order. Everybody goes bananas. I've never seen anything quite like it. And the Trump administration and his Jewish advisors were genuinely shocked because people were saying things like, well, this makes Jews a nationality, and that's what Stalin did. I came from Russia and my passport had this. And therefore, Trump is doing what Stalin did, and he's turning the Jews into a nation, a foreign nation. And that's also what Hitler did. The reaction was insane. And what it did, and people should know this, what it did was that makes a president extremely frustrated and ready to give up on stuff, because the point was, all right, we'll sign this thing that is obviously pro-Jewish. I mean, obviously pro-Jewish. And there was such a backlash from the Jewish community too, that it was like, I need this, like I need a hole in the head. Let's move on to other subjects, and you're going to drive presidents away from doing things like this and taking actions. And it's just worth noting that a few years later, he is fully fully vindicated in that executive order as everything that's happening on campus now. And everybody seems to agree with it, including the Biden administration, which has also gone in on this. So that's the danger, is kind of chasing presidents away, Republicans away from doing things that are good for the Jews, because the community is so oversensitive about the way that he talks that they're ready to oppose whatever it is. And that will delegitimize the idea of, in this case, Jews having Title VI civil rights protections on campus.
Look, the issue here is that there is no modulation in relation to Trump by these figures, in which you say, I am disappointed to hear President Trump talk this way about the community. He has been a friend to Israel. He's been this. He did Title VI. He should not talk this way. I'm very disappointed, as opposed to, no Jew can vote for Trump now. He is the second coming of Hitler, which, believe me, is very close to what was being said. And the people who say it should be ashamed of themselves. They should be ashamed of themselves.
You said something important when you introduced the topic, though, which we should note, which is that, you mentioned they were speaking this way about a former president. That, I think, is the key. And I think that we've mentioned this before, but he's been president. And that's what weakens some of the hysteria. The idea, when in 2016, look, my family did not have an easy time in 2016. We were highly critical of Trump. My wife was on the ADL's top 10 list of, Jewish political journalists targeted, by the alt-right. I mean, it was not a pretty thing. Then he became president, and he did all the things that he did. So this is not to say you have to change your mind about Trump. This is just to say that if you want to try to understand the impact that Trump will have as president, you have 4 years where he was president. And that's why it doesn't make sense to flip out over every one of these comments, because the flipping out is essentially a prediction. You elect this guy, we're going to reap the whirlwind, except the country already elected this guy. And actually, he tried to do things like apply Title VI rights to Jews on campus. And of course, as you mentioned, move the embassy and stuff like that. And that's the base that you have to look at, and not pretend that it's 2016 and we don't know what he's up to.
I think there's another issue here, which is also, people note, and it's an understandable point, certainly, that when Trump says what he says, he means one thing, but then there can be the lunatic individuals in MAGA who take it another way, and that this incites the anti-Semites on the lunatic right. But I have to say, the anti-Semites on the lunatic right, I think, are done with Trump. And they're mad at him for even talking to Jewish.
Yeah, Nick Fuentes has
voters.
just endorsed Nick Fuentes, the guy he had dinner with that has created all this. Literally, when somebody says Trump is good on Israel, somebody says, well, he had dinner with Nick Fuentes. Well, Nick Fuentes yesterday or the day before endorsed Kamala Harris.
Yeah. So they're mad at him for even addressing American Jews at all. They're not actually taking their marching orders or their coded signals from him, by and large.
So yeah, I mean that's true. That's true. Also, as I say, he shouldn't have said it. He shouldn't talk this way. He shouldn't talk the way he talks about anything, mostly. And he's hurting himself, and he continues to hurt himself. It's a tied race.
Maybe he
probably could
talk.
Be up by 5.
Maybe
he's really winning over
there.
He's really winning over the ladies' vote with his constant denigration of any female news or media personality who says something negative.
But
So he's doing great.
He is. He's saying, I don't want to talk, right? What is he saying about debates? He's like, no, it's too late.
He figured that part out. Yeah, if only he had thought that before he tweeted out, I hate Taylor Swift in all capital letters. He's an American original.
He is. Yes, that's the best thing you can say about him, probably. Anyway, it is time for commentary recommends, and I am taking the moment here to make a fun recommendation, a serious recommendation. The fun recommendation is a movie on Apple TV Plus, came out, I think, 6 weeks ago, called The Instigators, starring Matt Damon and Casey Affleck. It is a midnight run-like caper gone wrong, with a couple of shambling guys who end up on the run together around Boston, trying to evade a corrupt mayor, the gangsters who hired them, and a really scary cop who rides around in a tank, played by Ving Rhames. Casey Affleck, not Ben Affleck, his brother, the Academy Award-winning actor Casey Affleck, is hilarious in this movie, something I did not know he had even the remote capability of being. It is delightful, and I really strongly recommend it. The other recommendation I want to make is of a memoir by Randy Barnett. Randy Barnett is a professor at the at Georgetown Law School, and one of the very few serious conservatives at a very important law school, fought his way basically into tenure, having been a prosecutor in Cook County and others. This is a memoir of his life, hardscrabble life, rising up through the ranks and developing his, I think, controversial theory of constitutional originalism, which I'm not going to go into, in which I have some problems with, and what he calls originalism, but his life story is inspiring and interesting. His intellectual integrity is unimpeachable, and it's also a story of a Jewish kid making good, so it has a particular valence with commentary. So that's A Life for Liberty by Randy Barnett, which I commend to all and sundry. So with that, we will say goodbye until tomorrow. For Abe, Seth, Christine, and Madam John Podhoretz, keep the candle burning.